Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. Post office being underfunded as an intentional strategy because the perception by the president is that the there's going to be a big mail-in ballot because of the pandemic. Mail-in ballots favor Democrats. Therefore, the president has been attacking mail-in ballots as a part of delegitimizing the election. Not for nothing, Russia's making the same point because they want to delegitimize elections all over. But what it gets to is this question of the post office. And I've seen a lot of people passing memes around about the post office and its role in the government and how it's funded. And I want to kind of clarify some things from a context standpoint, just to give some baseline, because the post office is kind of a different animal, and there's been some bad reporting out there. So first off, yes, the post office is a constitutionally mandated activity, and it was a department within the United States government, like Department of Defense or Department of Interior or Department of State, up until 1970. 1970, there was a post office strike, and this is not necessarily, I mean, I'm going back in time here, but it's key to understand. The conditions for the post office were absolutely atrocious then. What happened is, as the boom happened in the 50s and the 60s, mainly you had black workers were the only ones who were accepted in the post office job. The conditions were horrible. The pay was low. They weren't allowed to unionize or collectively bargain because they were considered federal workers. They weren't allowed. And what happened was a small strike in New York rapidly grew into wildcat strikes, where the unions that didn't have collective bargaining weren't even in control of the strikes. This thing spread, and it was partly related to the civil rights and the racial issues that were going on at the time. And part of the demands were, we want to unionize and be able to bargain. And you know, Nixon was the president at the time. He said he threatened everyone, go back to work, and they not only ignored him, but more people went on a strike. Then he sent in the National Guard to deliver the mail. That didn't work. And for 8 days, it literally shut the economy down. Finally, they came to an agreement. And coming out of this was a law which reorganized the post office. And this is key to understand now, because how it reorganized it was as an independent agency. The post office is a self-funded agency. Its debts are owed by the government, but its funding comes from its own operations. And it was organized as a corporation. This is the part that I think a lot of people don't get. They're like, this isn't like any other part of the government. There are parts of the government, especially in independent agencies, that act more like corporations than they do federal agencies, not from a profit standpoint, but the way they're structured. And part of that reorganization, you know, the trade-off was the post office workers could get unions, they could collectivize, they could collectively negotiate. This wasn't, you know, there was wins on both sides. But you've got to now understand, from 1970 to 2006, there are pension requirements, because this is the big thing that people are getting into, that are building. But the post office, because it's got this weird structure, hasn't paid anything into its pension fund. This is pointed out in GAO reports and OMB reports as a risk. And in 2006, a bill gets passed, the Post Office Accountability and something Enforceability Act. And part of that is the context for the funding here. That bill says that to jumpstart the medical and retirement funding benefits, the post office has to pay in 10 years of funding, and then they can amortize out for 40 years. It basically brought the post office funding mechanism in line with other federal agencies. There's two agencies here, the Civil Service Retirement System, CSRS, and the Federal Employment Retirement System, FERS. These are the agencies that determine how pensions are funded, and their general rule of thumb is, and this is why you're going to hear these numbers, they calculate the obligation for 75 years. Now, an obligation is not the same as a cash payout. An obligation is an accounting number that says this is what your obligation is to fund. Then they say you can amortize that 75-year calculation over a 40-year amortization plan. So it's kind of like a mortgage, right? You're paying a piece of that 75 every 40 years. The post office, because it didn't have anything in the pension fund, had these really steep fees they had to pay in to basically buy into and start getting up. And this was going to happen from 2006 to 2016, 10 years, at which point the 40-year amortization would kick in. And it was a very heavy fee at the time. I mean, I'm not discounting this, but a lot of people are saying that they had to pay 75 years in advance. That's not true. It's a calculation obligation. And what happened is they only made those payments through 2012. So to the extent that the post office has a problem with funding now, It has nothing to do on a cash standpoint with medical or retiree benefits because those haven't been paid since 2012. And you can check this out if you read the 10K. A 10K is an annual report for a corporation. The post office, as a corporation, has a 10K. I've linked the 2019 one in there. And they basically lay out that they are now in the amortization period, and they say for 2019, 2018, 2017, OPM has billed us 1.6 billion, 1.4 billion, and 1.7 billion for this CSRS amortization payments due. We're not paying it because if we paid it, we think we would put our operations in jeopardy. So they're putting a position out that we're not paying into this fund because it would cause our existing operations to suffer. They also are supposed to pay into FERS, the other one, the FERS, which deals with the medical benefits, 1.1 billion, 958 million, 917 million. Anyways, every year the post office doesn't make these payments. So they're not paying anything into pension, medical, or retirements. And that's a little tricky. People like, if you were a corporation, you wouldn't have to pay all 75 years at once. That's true, but no one pays 75 years at once. They pay it over a 40-year amortization. And right now, there are no payments going in. And even if payments were going in, they aren't enough to explain the losses that are going on. So when I looked at the unfunded amounts that they're not paying, you're talking about close to $1 billion to $2 billion a year. Those two numbers I gave you are the amount they would pay for the 40-year amortization. Their net operating loss is closer to 8 to 9 billion. So there's a delta between even if we say, and I'm not saying the funding mechanism is legitimate or not. Let me get to that in a second. If the funding mechanism was the problem, the $2 billion they have to pay per year in funding would be roughly equivalent to the loss. The loss is about 4 times the funding requirement. So that's not the only reason why the funding is struggling. And I think a lot of these details are missed when people are talking about the post office. The post office has been declining ever since the internet came around. In 1970, when that strike happened, it shut the economy down. If a strike happened today, I don't know if we'd miss a beat. Yes, people would suffer. Yes, people wouldn't be able to get stuff, but it wouldn't shut the economy down because there's no more paper bills don't go out through the post office. A lot of stuff is online and virtual these days. Obviously, emails, all these things happening, and some of this is Congress's fault. Even though it's an independent agency, the post office, like one of the things that happened in 2006 is they were going to say, we're not going to deliver on Saturday because that's not profitable. And, Congress is like, whoa, you can't not deliver on Saturday in my district. I'm going to hear about it. You have to deliver on Saturday. So I think now as we shift to a talk of reform, completely aside from the 2020 election, the post office needs to be reformed badly. It's got to have, Congress has to make a decision of to what extent the post office is going to be able to manage delivery. Maybe because last mile delivery in rural areas is expensive and not profitable, maybe Congress provides a subsidy for that, just like they do with the phone taxes. If you're old enough to remember the phone tax where you had to pay a fee on your phones for supplying phone access to rural areas, maybe it's something like that. Maybe they give some more flexibility in how they're structuring services. There's going to be a negotiated settlement on this funding for pensions. I see this all the time with like the DOD basically doesn't want to do something. It takes this negotiating position and say, we're not going to comply with what we're required to do. And here's this reason, but what we're really hoping to do is Congress to come back and fix it. And that's what the post office has done on the pension funding since about 2012 on. Now, none of this has to do with the election funding and, but I think it's the context to understand that even if you go back this time last year, and this is why with all these campaign stories that go back, use Google search and set your parameters to January 1st, 2020 or 2 years ago. You will see that these discussions of fundings and cost overruns or financial challenges of the post office have been going on for a long time. Then on top of that, the pandemic comes in. And I've actually linked, there's a link in the article where the pandemic, they were describing that because of the pandemic, there will be delays in mails because they're trying to be safer. They got to be safer for their workers. This was in April that this was issued. It's not related at all to the election, but then suddenly Trump jumps in with the delegitimizing the mail. Now there's a lot of concerns. What's also getting this riled up is a post office letter went out to 46 states saying, if you're one of these 46 states, your mail might not be delivered in time. And what that is that's not saying that if you, at any point in the mail-in for mail-in ballots, it might not be delivered. It's identifying states that have a last chance to mail very close to the election. The election's November 3rd. If you've got a mail-in date that says you can mail your ballot in Pennsylvania, I think by October 26 or 28, that's only leaving a few days to get in time. So the post office, these letters, this warning letter was not all your mail-in ballots are at risk. It's saying if your acceptable date of where you cut off that people can mail is so close to the election, we're not going to hit that window. We're warning you now that that's a risk. Now, all of this stuff I just said may be water under the bridge because Congress has come back, hammered the president really hard. The president himself has flip-flopped and said he'll support it. And there may be some sort of reconciliation to stop all activities, whether they were routine or dastardly, stop all removal, stop all locking, stop the removal of the mail sorters and the cost, stop all those things till after the election. And honestly, I don't mind that, right? I can live with that. There was $25 billion allocated. Look, the pandemic, there was already $25 billion allocated for the post office in the very first stimulus negotiation back in April, March. It didn't get funded, but just like I said earlier, there's a crater. The post office, yeah, $25 billion, great. Give them the $25 billion. It's a crater. We need to fill it. This isn't me saying I think the post office is going to have a long and healthy future after the election. I'm just saying for the purposes of the election, put a pause on all this stuff right now, whether it was conspiracy or just routine, doesn't matter. The optics are terrible. Put it behind us and move on and deal with it after the election. That's where I sit on that. Yep. So I see there's a hearty debate. Yeah, there's a debate about Amazon. And this is good because this is one of the things. Would it shut Amazon down? Amazon, if you've noticed, has been building its own fleet of van service drivers to deliver. I don't know if this was in relation to the post office or some sort of long-term plan. They're also building a drone fleet to deliver packages, drone delivery packages. So I think the trend over time, that last mile delivery problem is either going to be solved by gig drivers and fleets of gig drivers or drones or some combination thereof of the two. I don't think it's a natural impossibility, but I think it's we're seeing kind of like when Netflix started doing DVDs by mail and people are like, wait, I don't have to go to Blockbuster anymore. The mechanism by which that last mile gets delivered, there's a lot of innovation going on in that area, and we're going to see how it plays out. I don't think, unless Congress allows the post office some flexibility, I don't think the post office is in a good spot because they're just going to be in the continuing position they are now where their rates are capped and they can't adjust their rates even if the delivery is more expensive. Yeah, Rory's mentioning P.O. boxes in town are the delivery method of many rurals. It's not like the UPS vehicles is driving 10 miles down a dirt road all over the country. It depends, Rory. I've been out in rural Nevada, and you get. It depends on the local post office. It really does vary by area. And so, but some areas, some rural areas they used to have central pickup areas where you would all go and get your mail in the central area. It may be returned to something like that. It may not. But I'm just trying to say that right, a lot of people, and people brought up medication. Medication is a valid point. There's a lot of delivery of medication, but I'm just saying the post office is continually losing money. So I am in favor of stopping all the removals, get them to 25 billion. Go out and buy stamps, whatever you want. That's not going to save the post office this time next year. In fact, it may hasten its decline to accelerate it in terms of the election. I think the election is more important ultimately right now in if I got to balance things, but just keep in mind, these issues won't go away just because the election happens. They're going to be long-term issues that the Congress will need to solve. And again, I'm not opposed to reform. If Congress wants to loosen up the restrictions on the post office, make some of those changes, that's fine. But the point of the context I wanted to provide was to show how we got here today was a multi-generational problem built up over decades. Trump walks in, sticks his foot in it, obviously stirs the pot, but that guy hasn't stayed consistent, since Syria. He flip-flopped and backed away from it. So I think with the post office, it's just something that I see a lot of these memes, and this is kind of probably maybe the last one of these I'm going to do. The whole post office thing blew up and was really important for a week or two. It's probably not going to be important in 2 weeks because something else is going to blow up. And this is where I go back to that moral panic and effective threat response. If you don't double check and triple check your sources and stories and things like that. You're going to get caught in, and it's happening on the red and the blue with increasing frequency. You're going to get caught in this cycle, and what it's going to do is harm yourself with mental health repercussions more than anything else. This chemical cycle with this affective response where we feel we're under threat. Like I said, I saw people ready to go out and pick up arms because they thought the post office boxes were being removed. Mind you, wouldn't have been a bright idea. They didn't know how to use them. I don't think they had any anyways. But especially as we go into campaign season, you know, Portland, Lafayette, there are legitimate concerns. We need to keep sharp for those ones and be able to sort the noise from the signal. Yeah, Tricia is saying that's the story with everything these days. Problems accumulated over time, and then Trump sticks his foot in it. I mean, for anyone who's been reading with me since 2001 when I started doing this, we've discussed governmental problems. I almost think I could go back sometimes, and the same list that we were talking about then is the same list now. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a mulleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.